So as I do the devotional today, I kind of have a question. And it's been a question that's been kind of, I guess, mulling around in my mind. And it's a question that I want to put to you today at the beginning of this. The question is, can grace change your heart? Can compassionate love and grace change who you are? Can it change your personal outlook on life? Can it change your worldview to recognize and receive the grace and compassionate love of God that we find in Jesus? So the thing that prompted me to think this was reflecting on the story that has come to be known as the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. It's one of those stories that gets told quite a bit, and it's one that many of us know fairly well. But it's a parable that Jesus tells, I think, to begin to illustrate how grace is poured out from God, and perhaps it's poured out in a way where that question lingers, does it change the heart? So the way the story goes, it begins like this. It's found in Luke chapter 15, beginning at verse 11. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So the father divided his property between the 2. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in desolate living." Now the parable goes on to talk about how a famine hits the land and he's spent everything, and so he is completely poor and he is longing to be fed by the things that the pigs eat. A big leap for someone who is Jewish. And yet while he's there in the midst of this despair, he remembers his father and he says, if I just go back, and plead for my father, hopefully he'll take me back as a slave. And so he rehearses his speech and then he sets off. So continuing on to the story, so he set off and he went to his father. But while he was still a far way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his slaves, "Quickly, bring out the robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found." And they began to celebrate. Now, at that point, a lot of times we end the parable, but Jesus had more to say. And what more he had to say had to do with that other son. He split the property between the 2 of them, and now we get to hear what happened with the older son. Now, his other elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and dancing, and he called one of the slaves and asked, "What's going on?" The slave replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he had gotten him back safe and sound." Then he became angry, and he refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, "Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your commandment. Yet you have never given me even a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead, and he has come to life. He was lost, but he's been found." Now, as I hear that story, again, I know a lot of times we focus that story on that younger son and what the younger son does, how he goes off and he spends everything he has. And of course, the focus then is on the way that dad loves him back into that family. But here's the thing, as I see this story and as I think about this story, one of the things that I've really been thinking about a lot lately is this concept of entitlement and privilege. You know, a lot of us have been talking about that, and those of us who are people of privilege and how we respond to that privilege by thinking ourselves to be entitled. What's interesting is as I think about this parable in this context, I'm beginning to see that, you know, both of these sons felt entitled and they used their privilege against their father. The one son does it in a much more blatant and obvious way. In fact, what he does is reprehensible. I mean, essentially what he's doing is he says, look, Dad, I know when you die, I'm going to get an inheritance, but you're worth to me more dead than you are alive. So how about if you just give me my money now so I can do what I want to? Give me what is owed me. Give me what I am entitled to have right now. I mean, it's awful. And anyone who is listening to that story would have thought that that was awful as well. But if you keep listening to the story and you get to the place of the older son, you'll see that he's just as awful. I mean, basically what he says to his dad is, look, I've been here and I've been slaving away and I've been doing all this, and you're not giving me what I really need. Give me what I really need. I'm entitled to be treated better than how you are treating me. Both of them have this overwhelming sense of privilege, and they respond to that by this sense of entitlement, shaking their finger at their father. Give me what you owe me. What's amazing in this story is that the father responds to both sons in the same way, with grace and compassion and love. And so the question is, does that grace change them? Because you see, it doesn't really matter if our sense of entitlement is blatant or subtle. It doesn't really matter if our sense of personal privilege is flaunted or if it is denied and we pretend like it isn't really there. It doesn't really matter how we use that sense of entitlement, how we respond to that privilege. The question is, once we begin to discover that all we have is a gift from God, and that is God's grace that is poured down upon us that allows us to have anything that we have, once we understand that, the question is, will that change our hearts? And the truth is, in the story, we don't know. Because you see, while the younger son does come back and does seem to confess to his father and throw himself on his father's mercy, we don't know what happens after that party's over, do we? I mean, he could have gone right back to his old way of living. Look at this, I fooled him. I've done it, I've come back, I'm a part of the family again. And that older son, well, he may have just stayed right out there in the field. And he may have said, to heck with this. I'm done because I didn't get everything I deserved. So we don't really know if grace changed the hearts of those two sons. But what about us? What about you and I? Does grace change us? Does it help us look in the mirror and see that our response to our privilege should not be a sense of entitlement, but should be a sense of understanding God's blessings being poured out upon us? We are invited not to respond with that kind of entitlement, blatant or hidden. We are called to respond by recognizing that all God has been given to us. And we now have a responsibility to share that with others and not to shove that back in others' faces. It is a challenging idea, this idea of whether or not grace will change us. It is a challenging idea, and yet it is an idea that we need to take time to contemplate. Because what happens time and time again is God pours grace upon grace upon grace, hoping that that will change our hearts. So take time to contemplate that this week. And thanks for listening.